It's never a bad time to tell a story. And what better story to tell than one that takes you to the moon and back? Chapter 13. Cress would not have believed that she had the strength to drag Carswell Thorne beneath the bed and secure his unconscious body against the wall if the proof wasn't in her arms. All the while, cords and screens and plugs and dishes and food jostled and banged around them. The walls of the satellite groaned and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying not to imagine the heat and friction melting through the bolts and seams, trying not to guess how stable this untested satellite could be. Trying not to think about plunging toward the Earth, its mountains and oceans and glaciers and forests, and the impact that a satellite thrown from space would have when it crashed into the planet and shattered into billions of tiny pieces. She was doing a poor job of not imagining it at all. The fall lasted forever, while her small world disintegrated. She'd failed. The parachute should have opened already. She should have felt it release, felt the snap back as it caught their descent and lowered them gently to Earth, but their fall was only faster and faster as the satellite's air grew warmer. Either she'd done something wrong or the parachute hatch was faulty, or perhaps there was no parachute at all, and the command was from false programming. After all, Sybil had commissioned this satellite. Surely she'd never intended to let Cress land safely on the blue planet. Sybil had succeeded. They were going to die. Cress wrapped her body around Carswell Thorne and buried her face into his hair. At least he would be unconscious through it all. At least he didn't have to be afraid. Then, a shudder. A sensation different from the drop. And she heard the brisk sound of nylon ropes and hissing, and there it was, the sudden jerk that seemed to pull them back up into the sky. She cried out and gripped Carswell Thorne tighter as her shoulders smacked into the underside of the bed. The fall became a sinking, and Cress's sobs turned to relief. She squeezed Thorne's prone body and sobbed and hyperventilated and sobbed some more. It took ages for the impact to come, and when it did, the jolt knocked Cress into the bed again. The satellite crashed and slid, rolled over and tumbled. They were slipping down something solid, perhaps a hill or a mountainside. Cress clenched her teeth against a scream and tried to protect Thorne with one arm while bracing them against the wall with the other. She had expected water. So much of the Earth's surface was water, not this solid something they'd hit. The spiraling descent finally halted with a crash that shook the walls around them. Cress's lungs burned with the effort to take in what air they could. Every muscle ached from adrenaline and the strain of bracing for impact and the battering her body had taken. But in her head, the pain was non-existent. They were alive. They were on Earth, and they were alive. A grateful, shocked cry fell out of her, and she embraced Thorne, crying happily into the crook of his neck. But the joy receded when he did not hold her back. She'd almost forgotten the sight of him hitting his head on the bed's frame, the way his body was thrown across the floor, how he'd slumped unnaturally in the corner and made no sound or movement as she'd hauled him beneath the bed. She pried herself away from him. She was covered in sweat, and her hair had tangled around them both, binding them almost as securely as Sybil's knotted sheets had. "Carswell," she hissed. It was strange to say his name aloud, like she hadn't yet earned the familiarity. She licked her lips, and her voice cracked the second time. "Mr. Thorne?" Her fingers pressed against his throat. Relief. His heartbeat was strong. She hadn't been sure during the fall whether he was breathing, but now, with the world quiet and still, she could make out wheezing air coming from his mouth. Maybe he had a concussion. Cress had read about people getting concussions when they hit their heads, but she couldn't remember what happened to them. But she knew it was bad. "Wake up. Please. We're alive. We made it." She placed a palm on his cheek, surprised to find roughness there, nothing at all like her own smooth face. Facial hair. It made sense, and yet somehow she'd never worked the sensation of prickly facial hair into her fantasies. She would amend that after this. She shook her head, ashamed to be thinking of something like that when Carswell Thorne was hurt right before her, and she couldn't do any. He twitched. Cress gasped and attempted to cushion his head in case he jerked around too much. "Mr. Thorne, wake up. We're all right. Please, wake up." A low, painful moan, and his breaths began to even out. Cress pushed her hair out of her face. It fought against her, clinging to her sweat-dampened skin. Long strands of it were pinned beneath their bodies. He groaned again. "Carswell?" His elbow lurched, like he was trying to lift his hand, but his wrists were still bound between them. His lashes fluttered. "What? Huh?" It's all right. I'm here. We're safe." Thorne dragged his tongue around his lips, then shut his eyes again. "Thorne," he grunted. "Most people call me Thorne. Or Captain." Her heart lifted. "Of course, Captain, are you in pain?" He shifted uncomfortably, discovering that his hands were still tied. "I feel like my brain's about to leak out through my ears, but otherwise, I feel great." Cress inspected the back of his head with her fingers. There was no dampness, so at least he wasn't bleeding. "You hit your head pretty hard," he grunted and tried to wiggle his hands out of the knotted blanket. "Hold on, there was that knife." She trailed off, scouring the clutter and debris around them. "It fell off the bed," said Thorne. "Yeah, I saw it. There!" She spotted the knife handle lodged beneath a fallen screen and went to grab for it, but her hair had gotten so wrapped up around her and Thorne that it yanked her back. She yelped and rubbed at her scalp. He opened his eyes again, frowning. I don't remember being tied together before." "I'm sorry, my hair gets everywhere sometimes, and if you could just... here, roll this way." She grabbed his elbow and nudged him into his side. With a scowl, he complied, allowing her enough movement to reach the knife handle. "Are you sure it's over?" Thorne started, but she had already draped herself over his side and was sawing through the blanket. "Oh, you have a good memory." "Hmm?" she murmured, focused on the sharp blade. It frayed easily, and Thorne sighed with relief as it fell away. He rubbed his wrists, then reached toward his head. When the tangles of Cress's hair tried to hold him back, he tugged harder. Cress yelped and crashed into Thorne's chest. He didn't seem to notice as his fingers found the back of his scalp. "Ow," he said. "Yeah," she agreed. "This bump is going to last a while. Here, feel this." "What?" He fished around for her hand, then brought it to the back of his head. "I have a huge bump back here. No wonder I have such a headache." He did indeed have an impressive bump on his scalp, but Cress could only think of the softness of his hair and the way she was practically lying on top of him. She blushed. "Yes, right. We probably should, She had no idea what he should probably do. Kiss her, she thought. Isn't that what people did after they survived thrilling near-death experiences together? She was sure it wasn't an appropriate suggestion, but this close, it was all she could think about. She learned to lean in closer, to press her nose into the fabric of his shirt and inhale deeply, but she didn't want him thinking she was odd. Or, guessing the truth, that this moment, filled with injuries and her destroyed satellite and being separated from his friends, was the most perfect moment of her entire life. His brow creased, and he picked at a lock of hair that had tightened around his bicep. "We need to do something about this hair." Right. She shifted away, her scalp screaming as her hair was trapped beneath them. She started to untangle the strands, gently one by one. "Maybe it would help if we turn on the lights?" She paused. "The lights? Are they voice-activated? If the computer system went down in the fall... Spades, it must be in the middle of the night. Is there a port screen or something we can turn on, at least?" Cress cocked her head. I don't understand." Oh. Oh no. So, if you remember at the end of the last video, and I had hoped that it was just unconscious, Oh, Thorn, I'm so sorry. He's blind. For the briefest moment, he seemed annoyed. It would help if we could see. His eyes were open, but he was looking blankly past Cress's shoulder. He pried away some strands of hair that had gotten twisted around his wrist, then waved his hands in front of his face. This is the blackest night I've ever seen. We must be somewhere rural. Is it a new moon tonight? His scowl deepened, and she could tell he was trying to remember when Earth was in its moon cycle. That doesn't seem right. Must be really overcast. Captain, it isn't dark. I can see just fine. He frowned in confusion, and after a moment, worry. His jaw flexed. Please... I'm getting a phone call. He frowned in confusion, and after a moment, worry. His jaw flexed. Please tell me you're practicing your sarcasm. No, that was a bit too stilted. Frown in confusion. Please tell me you're practicing your sarcasm. My sarcasm? Why would I do that? Shaking his head, he squeezed his eyes tight together, opened them again, blinked rapidly. Cursed. Pressing her lips, Cress held her fingers in front of him, waved them back and forth. There was no reaction. What happened? He said. The last thing I remember is trying to get under the bed. You hit your head on the bed frame, and I dragged you under here. And then we landed. A little rocky, but that's all. You just hit your head. And that can cause blindness? It might be some sort of brain trauma. Maybe it's only temporary. Maybe you're in shock. He settled his head on the floor. A heavy silence closed around them. Cress chewed on her lip. Finally, he spoke again, and his voice had taken on a determined edge. We need to do something about this hair. Where did that knife go? Before she could question the logic behind giving a knife to a blind man, she had set it into his palm. Thorn reached behind her with his other hand and gathered a fistful of her hair. The touch sent a delicious tingle down her spine. Sorry, but it grows back, he said, not sounding all apologetic. He began sawing through the tangles, one handful at a time. Grab, cut, release. Cress held perfectly still. Not because she was afraid of being cut. The knife was steady in his hands despite the blindness, and Thorn kept the blade angled carefully away from her neck. But because it was Thorn, it was Captain Carswell Thorn, running his hands through her hair, his rough jaw mere inches away from her lips, his brow furrowed in concentration. By the time he was brushing feather-soft fingers along her neck, checking for any strands he'd missed, she was dizzy with euphoria. He found a missing lock of her hair by her left ear and cut it away. I think that's it. He tucked the knife under his leg so he would know where to find it, and buried his hands into the short, impossibly light hair, working out the remaining tangles. A satisfied grin stretched over his face. Maybe a little jagged on the ends, but much better. Cress reached for the back of her neck, amazed at the sensation of bare skin, still damp from sweat, and short cropped hair that had a subtle wave to it now that all the weight was gone. She scratched her fingernails along her scalp, riveted by the pleasure of such a foreign sensation. It felt as though 20 pounds had been cut from her head. Tightness was fading from muscles that she hadn't even realized was there. Thank you. You're welcome, he said, brushing away the locks of hair that still clung to him. And I'm really sorry about the blindness. Not your fault. It is kind of my fault. If I hadn't asked you to come rescue me, and if I had... It's not your fault, he said again, his tone cutting off her argument. You sound like Cinder. She always blames herself for the stupidest things. The war is her fault. Scarlett's grandmother is her fault. I bet she'd take responsibility for the plague too if she could. Picking up the knife, he shimmied out from beneath the bed, pushing his arms out in a wide circle to nudge away any debris before pulling himself up onto the edge of the mattress. His progress was slow, like he didn't trust himself to move more than a few inches at a time. Cress followed and stood up beside him, shuffling some of the debris around with her bare toes. One hand stayed buried in her hair. "The point is, that witch tried to kill us, but we survived," said Thorn, "and we'll find a way to contact the Rampion, and they'll come and get us. We'll be fine." He said it like he was trying to convince himself. But Cress didn't need any convincing. He was right. They were alive, and they were together, and they would be fine. "I just need a moment to think," said Thorn. "Figure out what we're going to do." Cress nodded and rocked back on her heels. For a long time, Thorn seemed to be deep in thought, his hands clasped in his lap. After a minute, Cress realized they were shaking. Finally, Thorn tilted his head toward her. Though his unfocused eyes were on the wall, he took in a deep breath, let it out, then smiled. "Let's begin again with some proper introductions. Did I hear your name was Crescent?" "Just Cress, please." He extended a hand toward her. When she gave him hers, he tugged her closer, bent his head, and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. Cress stiffened and swooned, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. "Captain Carswell Thorn, at your service." I really like Thorn. I hated him at first, but I really like Thorn. Chapter 14. Cinder followed the progression of the Rampion on her retina display, watching breathlessly as they entered Earth's atmosphere over northern Africa and careened toward Farafra. Farafra. It says Farafra, but you say it in the accent Farafra. A small oasis that had once been a trading post for caravans traveling between the Central African provinces and the Mediterranean Sea. It had fallen into poverty since the plague had first struck a decade ago, sending the trade caravans further east. She didn't leave Wolf's side. She dressed the wounds as well as she could, using the bandages and ointments the guard had thrown down from the ship's upper level. She had already had to change the bandages once, and still the blood soaked through. His face was pale and clammy, his heartbeat grew weaker, each breath a struggle. "Please, please, let Dr. Erland be there." So far, the guard, at least, had proven trustworthy. He had flown straight and fast, very fast, to Cinder's relief. It was a risk entering Earth's orbit, but a necessary one. She only hoped this oasis would be the safe haven the doctor had believed it to be. "Cinder," said Echo, "the Lunar is asking where we should land." She shuddered. She'd been expecting the question. It would be safest and most prudent to land outside the town, out in the ruthless desert. But she could never carry Wolf, and they didn't have the luxury of being prudent. "Tell him to land on the main road. On the map it looks like there's only one, a town square of sorts. And tell him not to worry about being stealthy." If they couldn't hide, then she would draw as much attention as possible. Maybe if they made enough of a spectacle, it would draw Dr. Erland out from wherever he was hiding. She had to hope that any civilians would be so distracted by their brazenness they wouldn't bother alerting the police until it was too late. It wasn't a good plan, but there wasn't time to come up with anything better. The ship dove. Normally, this was the quiet part of the landing, when the engine's power switched to magnetic levitation, but it seemed the guard was planning on doing this all manually. Perhaps the town was so rural they didn't have magnetic roads at all. Finally, the ship clanked and groaned. Though it was a soft landing, the shock still made Cinder jump. Wolf groaned. Cinder bent over him and cupped his face in both hands. "Wolf, I'm going to get help. Just stay with us, all right? Just hold on." Standing, she keyed in the code for the podship dock. The dock was a sight, blood and destruction everywhere. But she walked past the remaining shuttle and tried to put it all from her thoughts. "Aiko. Open hatch." As soon as the doors had parted enough for her to fit through, she crouched on the ledge and jumped down into the street. A cloud of dust whirled around her as her feet struck the hard, dry ground. The surrounding buildings were mostly single-story structures made of stone or clay or large beige bricks. Some window shutters had been painted blue or pink, and stenciled designs lined the entryways. but the colors had been bleached by the sun and chipped by relentless sand. The road dipped down toward an oasis lake a few blocks to Cinder's right. Both sides lined with thriving palm trees. Trees that looked too alive for a town that hung with desertion. A few blocks to her left was a stone wall lined with more trees and, beyond it, reddish plateaus disappearing in a sandy haze. People were emerging from the buildings and around street corners, civilians of all ages, mostly dressed in shorts and lightweight tops to combat the desert heat, though a few wore more concealing robes to keep off the blazing sun. Many were covering their mouths and noses. At first, Cinder thought they were protecting themselves from the plague, but then she realized they were simply annoyed at how much dust the ship's landing had kicked up. The cloud was already blowing off down one of the side streets. Cinder scanned them, searching for a wrinkled face and a familiar gray cap. Dr. Erland would be paler than most of the townspeople, although skin tones ranged from the deepest browns to honeyed tans. Still, she suspected that a little old man with glaringly blue eyes would have drawn some attention in the past weeks. She opened her hands wide to show she had no weapons and took a step toward the crowd. Her cyborg hand was on full display, and the townsfolk had noticed. They were staring at it openly, though no one shied away as she took another step closer. "I'm sorry about the dust," she said, gesturing to the cloud, "but this is an emergency. I need to find someone, a man, this tall, wears old glasses and a hat. Have any of you—" "I saw her first!" a girl squealed. She ran out from the crowd, her flip-flops smacking the dirt, and grasped Cinder's arms. Startled, Cinder tried to pull away, but the girl held firm. Then there were two boys, not older than 10 or 9, emerging from the crowd and arguing over who had seen the ship drop out of the sky, who had seen it land, who had seen the docks open, and who had first spotted the cyborg. "Step away from Miss Lynn, you greedy little vultures." Cinder whirled around. Dr. Erland was striding toward them, though she almost didn't recognize him. Barefoot and hatless, he wore a pair of khaki shorts and a striped shirt that hung lopsided, as he'd missed a buttonhole, and the rest of the buttons were all wrong. His gray hair stuck out along his bald spot like he'd recently been electrocuted. None of that mattered. She'd found him. "I suppose you can all share the prize for finding her, even though the deal was to bring her to me, not to make me come all the way down here in the center of the sun heat." He pulled a bag of gummy candies from his pocket and held it up over the children's heads, forcing them to promise to share before he handed it over. They snatched it and ran away squealing. The rest of the townspeople remained where they were. Dr. Erland planted his hands on his hips and glared up at Cinder. "You have much explaining to do. Do you know how long I've been waiting for you, watching the—" "I need your help," she said, stumbling toward him. "My friend, he's dying. He needs a doctor. I don't know what to do." He scowled, then his attention caught on something over Cinder's shoulder. The Lunar Guard emerged at the edge of the ship, shirtless and covered in blood, and straining to support Wolf's body. "What? He's a Lunar Guard," said Cinder, "and Wolf is one of her soldiers. It's a long story, and I'll explain later, but can you help him? He was shot twice. He's lost a lot of blood." Dr. Erland raised an eyebrow. Cinder could tell he wasn't at all thrilled with the company she was keeping. "Please." Harumphing, he gestured at some of the onlookers and called out a few names. 3 men stepped forward. "Bring him to the hotel. Gently," he said, with a sigh. He set about redoing the buttons on his shirt. "Follow me, Miss Lynn. You can help me prepare the tools." Chapter 15. "I suppose it's too much to hope that we landed ourselves near any sort of civilization," Thorne said, tilting his head to one side. Cress picked her way through the debris to the nearest window. "I'm not sure we want to be near civilization. You're a wanted criminal in 3 earthen countries, and one of the most recognizable men on Earth." "I am pretty famous now, aren't I?" Grinning, he waved a hand at her. I guess it doesn't matter where we went, or what we want. What do you see out there?" Let me try that again. "I guess it doesn't matter what we want. What do you see out there?" Standing on tiptoes, Cress peered into the brightness. As her eyes adjusted to the glare, they widened, trying to take it all in. All at once it dawned on her. She was on Earth. On Earth. She'd seen pictures, of course. Thousands and thousands of photographs and vids. Cities and lakes and forests and mountains, every landscape imaginable. But she had never thought the sky would be so impossibly blue, or that the land could hold so many hues of gold, or could glitter like a sea of diamonds, or could roll and swell like a breathing creature. For one moment, the reality of it all poured into her body and overflowed. Cress? It's beautiful out there. A hesitation before. Could you be more specific? The sky is this gorgeous, intense blue color. She pressed her fingers to the glass and traced the wavy hills on the horizon. Oh, good. You're really narrowing it down for me. I'm sorry. It's just... She tried to stamp down the rush of emotion. I think we're in a desert. Cactuses and tumbleweeds? No, just a lot of sand. It's kind of orangish gold with hints of pink, and I can see tiny clouds of it floating above the ground, like smoke. Piled up in a lot of hills? Yes, exactly. And it's beautiful. Thorn snorted. If this is how you feel about a desert, I can't wait until you see your first real tree. Your mind will explode. She beamed out at the world. Trees. Ugh, that explains the heat then, Thorn said. Cress in her thin cotton dress hadn't noticed before, but the temperature did seem to be rising. The controls must have been reset in the fall, or perhaps destroyed altogether. A desert would not have been my first choice. Do you see anything useful? Palm trees, watering holes, a pair of camels out for a stroll? She looked again, noting how a pattern of ripples had been carved into the landscape, repeating for eternity. No, there's nothing else. All right, here's what I need you to do. Thorn ticked off on his fingers. First, find some way to contact the Rampion. The sooner we can get back on my ship, the better. Second, let's see if we can get that door open. We're going to be baked alive if the temperature keeps rising like this. Cress studied the mess of screens and cords on the floor. The satellite was never installed with external communication abilities. The only chance we had of contacting your crew was of the decom chip that Sybil took. And even if we did have some way of contacting them, we won't be able to give exact coordinates unless the satellite positioning system is still functioning. And even then... Thorn held up his hand. One thing at a time. We have to let them know that we're not dead, and check that they're all right too. I think they're capable of handling two measly lunars, but it would put my mind at ease to be sure. He shrugged. Once they know to start looking for us, maybe Cinder can whip up a giant metal detector or something. Cress scanned the wreckage. I'm not sure anything is salvageable. The screens are all destroyed, and judging from the loss of temperature regulation, the generator is... Oh no, little Cress! She wailed and kicked her way to the main data board that had housed her younger self. It was crushed on one side, bits of wire and plastic dangling from the shell. Oh, little Cress. Who's little Cress? She sniffed. Me, when I was 10. She lived in the computer and kept me company. And now she's dead. She squeezed the data board against her chest. Poor sweet little Cress. After a long silence, Thorn cleared his throat. Scarlet did warn me about this. Do we need to bury little Cress before we can move on? Want me to say a few words for her? Cress glanced up, and though his expression was sympathetic, she thought he was probably mocking her. I'm not crazy. I know she's just a computer. It's just... I programmed her myself, and she was the only friend I had. That's all. Hey, I'm not judging. I'm familiar with IT relations. Just wait until you meet our spaceship. She's a riot. His expression became thoughtful. Speaking of spaceships, what about that other pod, the one the guard docked with? Oh, I'd forgotten about that. She tucked the data board beneath its slanted desk and tripped over to the other entryway. The satellite sat at an angle, with the second entry near the lower end of the slope, and she had to clear away countless bits of plastic and broken equipment before she could get to the control screen. The screen itself was down. She couldn't get a flicker of power out of it, so she opened the panel that housed the manual override locks instead. A series of gears and handles had been set into the wall over the door, and while Cress had known they were there for years, she'd never given them much thought before. The devices were stuck from years of neglect, and it took all the strength to pull on the handle, planting one foot on the wall to gain leverage. Finally, it snapped down, and the doors sprang open, leaving a gap. Hearing her struggle, Thorn got up and trudged toward her, carefully kicking debris out of his way. He kept his hands outstretched until he bumped into her, and together they pried open the door. Hearing her struggle, Thorn got up and trudged toward her, carefully kicking debris out of his way. He kept his hands outstretched until he bumped into her, and together they pried open the door. The docking hatch was in worse shape than the satellite. Almost an entire wall had been sheared off, and piles of sand had already begun to blow in between the cracks. Wires and clamps dangled from the shattered wall panels, and Cress could smell smoke and the bitter scent of burned plastic. The pod ship had been showed up into the corridor, crumpling the far end of the hatch like an accordion. The docking clamp had been rammed straight through the ship's cockpit control panel, filling the glass with hairline fractures. Please tell me that it looks better than it smells. No, hang on, let me try it again. Please tell me it looks better than it smells, said Thorn, hanging onto the doorframe. Not really. The ship is destroyed. It looks like all the instruments, too. Gross. Cress climbed down, holding onto the wall for balance. She tried pressing some buttons to bring the ship back to life, but it was useless. All right, next plan. Thorn rubbed his eyes. We have no way of contacting the Rampion, and they have no way of knowing we're alive. Probably won't do us much good to stay here and hope someone passes by. We're going to have to try and find some sort of civilization. She wrapped her arms around herself, a mix of nerves and giddiness swirling in her stomach. She was going to leave the satellite. It looks like the sun was setting, she said, so at least we won't be walking in the heat. Thorn screwed up his lips in thought. This time of year, the nights shouldn't be cold, too cold. No matter which hemisphere we've landed in, we need to gather up... This time of year, the nights shouldn't be too cold, no matter which hemisphere we've landed in. We need to gather up all the supplies we can carry. Do you have any more blankets? And you'll want a jacket. Cress rubbed her palms down the thin dress. I don't have a jacket. I've never needed one. Thorn sighed. Figures. I do have another dress that isn't quite so worn as this one. Pants would be better. She glanced down at her bare legs. She'd never worn pants before. These dresses are all Sybil brought me. I don't have any shoes either. No shoes? Thorn massaged his brow. Alright, fine. I went through survival training in the military. I can figure this out. I do have a few bottles we can fill with water and plenty of food packs. It's a start. Water is our first priority. Dehydration will be a much bigger threat than hunger. Do you have any towels? A couple. Good. Bring those and something we can use for rope. He raised his left foot. While you're at it, do you have any idea where my other boot ended up? My dogs are being weird over there. I'm also like hunched out of frame. Why don't I get back in frame? It'd be nice. Are you sure you don't want me to do that? Thorn scowled, his empty gaze pinned somewhere around her knee. I may be temporarily blind, but I'm not useless. I can still tie good knots. Cress scratched at her ear and withheld further comments. She was seated on the edge of her bed, braiding a discarded lock of her own hair to use for rope, while Thorn knelt before her. His face was set in concentration as he wrapped a towel around her foot, then looped the rope around her ankle and the arch of her foot a few times before securing it into an elaborate knot. We want them to be nice and tight. If the fabric is too loose, it will rub and give you blisters. How does that feel? She wiggled her toes. Good, she said, and waited until Thorn had finished the other foot before surreptitiously adjusting the folds of the cloth to be more comfortable. When she stood, it felt strange, like walking on lumpy pillows, but Thorn seemed to think she'd be grateful for the makeshift shoes when they were out in the desert. Together, they'd fashioned a bundle out of a blanket, which they filled with water, food, bedsheets, and a small med-kit that Cress had rarely needed. The knife was safely in Thorn's boot, and they disassembled part of the busted bed frame for Thorn to use as a walking cane. They each drank as much water as they could stand, and then, as Cress gave one last inspection of the satellite and could think of nothing else worth taking, she stepped to the docking hatch and pulled down the manual unlock lever. With a ka-thunk, the door's internal devices released. The hydraulics hissed. A crack opened between the metal doors, allowing Thorn to get his fingers in and push one side into its wall pocket. A breeze of dry air blew into the satellite, a scent of cress had no comparison for. It was nothing like the satellite or the machinery or Sybil's perfume. Earth, she supposed, memorizing the aroma, or desert. Thorn swung the makeshift supply bundle over his shoulder, kicking some debris out of the way. He reached his hand toward Cress. Lead the way. Lead the way. He wouldn't be too commanding, he'd be more sympathetic. It wouldn't be lead the way, it'd be lead the way. Yeah, something like that. His hand encased hers, and she wanted to savor the moment. The sensation of touch and warmth and this perfect smell of freedom. But Thorn was nudging her forward before the moment had settled. At the end of the docking hatch was the rail and 2 steps leading down to where a podship normally attached. But now there was only sand, tinted lavender as night's shadow crept toward. It had already started to blow up on the 2nd step, and Cress had a vision of the satellite slowly being slowly buried beneath it, disappearing forever in the desert. And then she looked out, past the railing and the dunes, toward the rolling horizon. The sky was a haze of violet, and where that faded away, blue and black and stars. The same stars she'd known all her life, and yet now they were spread out like a blanket over her. Now there was an entire sky and an entire world ready to engulf her. Her head swam, suddenly dizzy. Cress stumbled backward, crashing into Thorn. Oh, she's not used to gravity, maybe? She tried to swallow down the rising panic, the sensation that her existence was as small and unimportant as the tiniest fleck of sand blowing against her shins. There was a whole world, a whole planet, and she was stuck somewhere in the middle of it, away from everything. There were no walls, no boundaries, nothing to hide behind. A shudder swept over her. Goosebumps crawled across her bare arms. Cress, what happened? What do you see? Thorn's fingers tightened on her arm before she realized she was trembling. She stammered twice before forcing the thought out of her head. It's so big. What's so big? Everything. Earth, the sky. It didn't seem so big from space. Her pulse was a drum, thundering through every artery. She could hardly take in any air, and she had to cover her face and turn away before she could breathe again. Even then the sensation was painful. Suddenly she was crying, without knowing when the tears had started. Thorn's hands found her elbows, tender and gentle. There was a moment in which she expected to be taken into his arms. Pressed warm and safe against his chest, she yearned for it. But instead, he shook her, hard. Stop it! Cress hiccuped. What is the #1 thing people die from in the desert? She blinked, and another hot tear slipped down her cheek. What? The #1 cause of deaths. What is it? Dehydration? She said, recalling the Survival 101 lecture he'd given her while filling up their water bottles. And what does crying do? It took a moment. Dehydrates? Exactly. His grip relaxed. It's all right to be scared. I get that until now, most of your existence has been contained in 200 square meters. In fact, so far you've shown yourself to be saner than I expected. She sniffed, unsure if he'd just complimented or insulted her. But I need you to pull yourself together. You may have noticed I'm not exactly in prime form right now, and I'm relying on you to be aware and observant and help us find our way out of this. Because if we don't, I don't know about you, but I'm just not fond of the idea of being stranded out here and eaten alive by vultures. So, can I depend on you to hold it together? For both of us. Yes, she whispered through her chest, though her chest was about to burst with all the doubts being crammed into it. Thorn squinted, and she didn't think he believed her. I'm not convinced you've fully grasped the situation here, Cress. We will be eaten, alive, by vultures. Can you visualize that for a second? Yes, vultures, I understand. Good, because I need you. And those are not words that I throw around every day. Now, are you going to be all right? Yes, I just need a moment. This time, she took in an extra deep breath and shut her eyes and grappled for a daydream. Any daydream. I'm an explorer, she whispered, setting courageously off into the wild unknown. It was not It was not a daydream she'd ever had before, but she felt the familiar comfort of her imagination wrapping around her. She was an archaeologist, a scientist, a treasure hunter. She was a master of land and sea. My life is an adventure, she said, growing confident as she opened her eyes again. I will not be shackled to this satellite anymore. Thorn tilted his head to one side. He waited for 3 heartbeats before sliding one hand down into hers. I have no idea what you're talking about, but we'll go with it. Blind and lost in the desert. Overwhelmed by the majesty and beauty of the planet. The moon doctor is trying to save the wolf man. He gave the kids some Sour Patch Kids, or maybe some gummy bears. Hey, thanks for finding the renegade moon princess that everyone's been looking for. Here's some fucking dollar store candy. To be fair, though, middle of the desert, they've never seen that candy before, so can't wait to see what happens next. I'm gonna have one last sip of... Well, there's a lot in here. Hang on. Leaf juice. It's good for you. See, you have to wet your whistle. Nice warm leaf juice. Go into your garden. Get a handful of leaves. Let them dry on the counter. Pour hot water on them. Now you too have hot leaf juice. Anyway. I don't know. I don't think that's how it works. It could be how it works. I don't know. Can I please not have my forehead be so damn shiny? What is going on with this? It's the lighting. Chapter 16. Thorn passed the makeshift cane to his opposite side so he could hold Cress's elbow as they stepped out onto the sand. She kept her head down, carefully choosing each step, but also afraid that if she looked up into the sky, her legs would freeze beneath her, and she would never be able to make the move again. When they'd gone a safe distance from the satellite, Cress tentatively lifted her gaze. Ahead of her was the same eternal landscape, the sky growing darker. She glanced back toward the satellite and gasped. Thorn's hand squeezed her elbow. Those are mountains, she said, gaping at the jagged peaks along the horizon. He squinted. Mountains or glorified hills? She considered the question, comparing the sight before her with the photos of mountain ranges she'd seen on the screens. Dozens of peaks of varying heights disappeared into the blackness of night. I think real mountains, she said, but it's getting dark, and I can't see any white on top. Do mountains always have snow? Not always. How far are they? They seemed close, but the foothills and sand dunes between them could have been deceiving, and she'd never been asked to judge distances before. Never mind. Thorn tapped the cane against the ground. It stirred something in Cress's gut when he didn't let go of her arm, though perhaps he appreciated the tethering sensation as much as she did. What direction are they in? She took his hand and pointed. Her heart was fluttering erratically, and she felt herself trapped between elation and terror. Even from this distance, she could tell that the mountains were enormous, hulking ancient beasts lined up like an impenetrable wall, dividing this wasteland. But at least they were something. A physical, visual marker to break up the monotony of the desert. They somehow calmed her, even while making her feel as insignificant as ever. So that must be south, right? He pointed in another direction. The sun set over there? She followed his gesture, where a faint green light could still be seen over the rolling dunes, fading fast. Yes, she said, a shaky smile stretching across her lips. Her first true sunset. She'd never known sunsets could be green, and had never known just how quickly the darkness set in. Her thoughts hummed as she tried to pull together every minute detail to store this moment safely away in a place where she would never, ever forget. Not the way the light turned dull and hazy above the desert. Not the way the stars emerged from the black. not the way her instincts kept her gaze from wandering too far up into the sky, keeping her panic at bay. "Do you see any plant life? Anything other than sand and mountains?" "Not from here, but I can hardly see anything." Even as they spoke, the blackness was taking over, the once golden sand turning into shadows beneath her feet. "There's our parachute," she added, noting the deflated white fabric that stretched out over a sand dune. It was already being swallowed up by the shifting sands. A trench had been carved into the dune where the satellite had hit and slid down. "We should cut off a piece," said Thorn. "It could come in handy, especially if it's waterproof." They said little as Cress guided him up the dune, the journey made difficult by the unstable ground. Thorn was awkward with the cane, trying to test the ground ahead of him without digging the tip into the hillside and stabbing himself at the other end. Finally, they reached the parachute and managed to cut off a square large enough to be used as a tarp. "Let's head toward the mountains," said Thorn. "It will keep us from walking directly into the sun in the morning, and with any luck, they'll offer some shelter, maybe even some water." Cress thought it sounded like as good a plan as any, but for the first time she noted a tinge of uncertainty in Thorn's tone. He was just guessing. He didn't know where they were or what direction would lead them to civilization. Every step they took could be leading them farther and farther from safety. But a decision had to be made. Together they started up the next dune. The day's heat was fading and a mild breeze kicked sand at her shins. When they reached the top, she found herself staring into an ocean of nothingness. Night had arrived, and she couldn't even make out the mountains anymore. But as the stars grew brighter and her eyes adjusted, Cress realized that the world around her was not pitch black, but tinged with a faint silver hue. Thorn tripped, yelling as he stumbled and collapsed onto his hands and knees. The makeshift cane was left jutting up from the sand, having narrowly missed impaling Thorn when he fell. Fuck. Gasping, Cress dropped to her knees beside him and pressed one hand against his back. "Are you all right?" Roughly shaking her off, Thorn pushed himself back to sit on his heels. In the dim light, Cress could see that his jaw was clenched tight, his hands balled to fists. "Captain?" "I'm fine," he said, an edge to his tone. Cress hesitated, her fingers hovering over his shoulder. She watched as his chest expanded with a slow breath and listening to the shaky, strained exhale. He began, speaking slowly, "am not happy with this turn of events." Cress bit her lip, burning with sympathy. "What can I do?" After a moment of glaring absently toward the mountains, Thorn shook his head. "Nothing," he said, reaching back until his arm hit the cane. He wrapped his fingers around it. "I can do this. I just need to figure it out." "Captain." He climbed to his feet and yanked the traitorous cane out of the sand. "Actually, if you could give me some warning when we're coming up on a hill, or about to start heading down again, that would help." "Of course. We're almost at the top of—" She trailed off as her eyes left Thorn's face to seek out the top of the dune and caught on the moon. A crescent glowing vivid and white off the horizon. She shriveled away from it, habit telling her to hide beneath her desk or bed until the moon couldn't find her anymore. But there was no desk or bed to crawl beneath. And as the initial surprise wore off, she began to realize that the sight of the moon didn't grip her with terror as it once had. From Earth, it somehow seemed so very far away. She gulped. "Almost to the top of this dune." Thorn quirked his head to the side. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I can see Luna. That's all." She let her gaze wander away from the moon, taking in the night sky. She was tentative at first, worried that looking at the sky would once again overwhelm her, but soon she discovered that there was something comforting about seeing the same galaxy she'd always known. The same stars she'd been looking at all her life, seen through a new lens. The tension in her body released, bit by bit. This was familiar. This was safe. The faint swirl of gases in the universe, glowing purple and blue. The sparkle of thousands and thousands of stars, as numerous as sand grains, as breathtaking as an earthen sunrise seen through her satellite window. Her pulse skipped. "Wait! The constellations!" she said, spinning in a circle while Thorn brushed the sand from his knees. "What?" There's Pegasus and Pisces and... Oh! It's Andromeda!" "What are you... Oh!" Thorn dug the cane into the sand, setting his weight against it. "For navigation," he rubbed his jaw. "Those are all northern hemisphere constellations. That rules out Australia, at least. Wait, give me a minute. I can figure this out. Cress pressed her fingers against the sides of her face, trying to picture herself looking at the same constellations. How many countless times from the windows of her satellite? She focused on Andromeda, the largest in sight, with its alpha star glowing like a beacon not far off from the horizon. Where would her satellite have been in relation to Earth when she was seeing that star at an angle? After a moment, the constellations began to spread out like a holograph in her mind, as if she were seeing the shimmering illusion of Earth rotating slowly before her, surrounded by spaceships and satellites and stars, stars, stars. I think we're in northern Africa, she said, turning around to scan the other constellations that were emerging from the ocean of stars. Or possibly the Commonwealth in one of the western provinces. Thorn's brow knit together. Could be the Sahara. His shoulders began to slump, and Cress saw the moment when he realized that it made no difference what hemisphere they were in, what country. It was still a desert. It was still trapped. We can't stand here stargazing all night, he said, bending down to pick up the bag of supplies and resituate it on his shoulder. Let's keep heading toward those mountains. Cress tried to offer him her elbows again, but Thorn only gave it a gentle squeeze before letting go. Throws off my balance, he said, testing the length of the cane so he could walk without spearing it into the ground again. I'll be fine. Burying her disappointment, Cress started up the dune. She announced the top when they reached it and continued down the other side. I'm sorry, it wasn't a boring chapter. I don't know why I yawned. That's interesting, though. Navigation using the stars. Very, very smart, Cress. I'm a big fan. Very good. Thorn, just start making out with her already, please. We already know we're waiting for it. Chapter 17. Scarlet was piloting the pod ship. She could not recall how long she'd been flying it, or where she had been before, or how she had ended up with these controls, behind these controls. But she knew very well why she was there. Because she wanted to be. Because she needed to be. If she did well, she would be rewarded. The thought made her feel joyful, eager, willing. I completely forgot about Scarlet. And so she flew fast. She flew steady. She allowed the little ship to become an extension of her. Her hands gripping the controls, her fingers dancing over the instruments. She had never flown so well, not since the day her grandmother had begun teaching her in the delivery ship around the farm. How the ship had warbled under her unskilled hands. How it rocked and sank, its landing gear brushing against the just-tilled dirt. Then miraculously drifted back up toward the sky as her grandmother's patient voice talked her through the steps. The memory disappeared as fast as it had come, snapping her back into the pod ship. And she could not remember what she had just been thinking. She could only think of this flight, this moment, this responsibility. Dog, this is a very, very short chapter. This chapter is 4 pages. 3.5, rather. She paid no heed to the stars blurring out in all directions. She gave no thought to the planet falling farther and farther behind her. In the ship's backseat, the woman was hissing and cursing as she tended to her wound. She was upset, and this alone bothered Scarlet, because she wanted the woman to be pleased. Eventually, the angry muttering died down, and then the woman was talking. Scarlet's heart fluttered, until she realized that it was not to her that the woman was speaking. Rather, she had sent out a calm. She heard 2 words that sent a bolt of panic through her. Your Majesty. She was talking to the Queen herself. It occurred to Scarlet that this knowledge should terrify her, but she couldn't recall why. Rather, she felt embarrassed to be listening in. It wasn't her place to be curious. She tried to ignore the conversation, allowing her mind to muddle and wander. Inside her head, she recited childhood rhymes that she hadn't thought of in years. It mostly worked. Only when a name broached her consciousness did curiosity overcome her. Lynn Cinder. No, I haven't. No, I could not capture her. I was overpowered. I am sorry, Your Majesty. I have failed you. Yes, I have already sent the last known coordinates of the ship to the Royal Guard. I was able to capture a hostage, Your Majesty. One of her accomplices. Perhaps she has information on where Lynn Cinder might go next or what her plan could be. I know it isn't good enough, Your Majesty. I will make this up to you, Your Majesty. I will find her. The conversation ended, and Scarlet's ears burned at having eavesdropped. She was ashamed. She deserved punishment. In an attempt to make up for her delinquency, she refocused on her task, flying as smooth and as fast as any pilot had ever flown. She thought only of how she must fly well. She thought only of how she must make her mistress proud of her. She felt no awe as she approached the great crater-filled Luna with its gleaming white surface and sparkling domed cities. Cities that were home to countless strangers. Cities that had been this home, that had been his home, once. She flinched at the intrusive thought. She did not know what it meant. She could not remember who he was. But this was where he came from. She suppressed the voice out of nervous panic that her mistress would sense her confusion. She did not want that. There was no confusion. She knew precisely where she wanted to be, precisely who she wished to be serving. Scarlet felt no fear as the moon dwarfed the tiny ship, expanded until it was all she could see through the glass. She paid no attention to the hot tears as they crept down her cheeks and dripped soundlessly into her lap. What kind of torture is that gotta be, though? Like, she's in love with Wolf, right? And she wants to... She's thinking, oh, Wolf came from the moon. This is his home. But she can't remember that it's Wolf because Sybil's in control of her. So all she can do is do what she was told to do and cry silently. Hypnotized with nothing to do. I have no mouth, and yet I must scream. Chapter 18. It didn't take long for Cress and Thorn to fall into a pattern. As Thorn became more comfortable with the movement of the sand underneath them and the sensation of the cane in his hand, he grew more confident, and their pace increased. 3 dunes. 5. 10. Before long, Cress realized that it took a lot less energy to stay in the valleys between the dunes when they could, so she began cutting a slower, yet less exhausting zigzag route across the desert. As she walked, the towels around her feet began to loosen. Grains of sand slipped in and got caught between her toes, despite how tight Thorn had tied the ropes of hair. The soles of her feet began to burn, and a cramp was threatening to overtake her left foot from the constant grab and release of her toes on the unstable ground. Her legs ached. Cress's body began to rebel as they rambled up yet another dune. Her thighs would burn as she crested one more hill, but then her shins would cry out as they descended the other side. Her silly fitness routines aboard the satellite hadn't prepared her for this. But she's better off for having done it. But she did not complain. She panted a great deal. She swiped at the sweat drops on her temples. She clenched her jaw against the hurt, but she did not complain. At least she could see, she reminded herself. At least she didn't have to carry the supplies. She heard Thorn switch shoulders from time to time, but he didn't complain either. Sometimes when they struck a flat spot, she closed her eyes to see how long she could go without opening them. Vertigo would set in almost immediately. Panic would blossom at the base of her spine and crawl up it until she was sure each new step would bring her in contact with a rock or a small hill, and she would stumble face first into the sand. The 4th time she did it, Thorn asked her why they kept slowing down. She kept her eyes open after that. "Do you need to take a break?" Thorn asked hours later. "No," she huffed, her thighs burning. "We're almost to the top of this dune." "Sure? No point passing out from exhaustion." Excuse me. She breathed a sigh of relief upon reaching the top of the dune, but dread quickly took its place. She didn't know why she'd expected this dune to be different from the dozens they'd already crested. She didn't know why she'd been thinking that this must have marked the end of the desert, because she didn't think she could go much farther. But it was not the end. The world was made of more dunes, more sand, more nothingness. "Really, let's take a break," Thorn said, setting down the pack and stabbing the cane into the ground. He spent a moment working the kinks from his shoulders before hunching over and undoing the bundle's knot. He handed Cress one of the water bottles and took another for himself. "Shouldn't we ration it?" she asked. He shook his head. "It's best to drink when we're thirsty, and just try to keep the sweating to a minimum, as much as possible. Our bodies will be able to maintain hydration that way, even if we do run out of water. And we should avoid eating until we find another water source. Digestion uses up a lot of water, too." "That's fine. I'm not hungry." Which was true, the heat seemed to have stolen what appetite she'd had. When she'd drank all she could, Cress handed the bottle back to Thorn and fantasized about collapsing into the sand and going to sleep, but she dared not, fearing she would never get up again. When Thorn lifted the pack, she took off down the hill without question. "What do you think is happening on your ship?" Cress asked as they descended the hill. The question had been echoing in her mind for hours, but the water finally made her capable of speech. "Do you think Mistress Sybil—" "They're fine. No. They're fine," Thorn said with unrelenting confidence. "I pity the person who goes up against Wolf, and Cinder's made of tougher stuff than people realize." A pause before a hearty laugh burst through the quiet air. Literally, in fact. "Wolf, that must be the other man on the ship." "Yes, and Scarlet is his... Well, I don't really know what they call themselves, but he's lunatic crazy for her. Scarlet's not a bad shot herself. That thaumaturge had no idea what she was walking into." Cress hoped he was right. Mistress Sybil had found them because of her, and the guilt was as painful as the deep aches in her bones. "So how did a girl born on Luna get stuck in a satellite and become an Earthen sympathizer anyway?" She wrinkled her nose. "Well, when my parents found out I was a shell, they gave me up to be killed because of the infanticide laws. But Mistress saved me and raised me instead, along with some of the other shells she'd rescued. She mostly just wanted us for some sort of experiments they're always running, but Mistress never really explained it to me. We used to live in some of the lava tubes that had been converted into dormitories, and we were always being monitored by these cameras that were connected to Luna's communication system. It was sort of cramped, but not too bad. We had ports and net screens, so we weren't entirely cut off from the outside world. After a while, I got really good at hacking into the communication system, which I mostly just used for silly stuff. We were all curious about school, so I used to hack into the lunar school system and download the study guides, things like that." Cress squinted up at the moon, now so far away. It was hard to believe it's where she came from. "Then one day, one of the older boys, Julian, asked me if I thought I could find out who his parents were. It took a couple of days, but I did, and we learned that his parents lived in one of the lumber domes, and that they were both alive, and that he had 2 younger siblings. And then we figured out how to send him a message and tell them that he was alive. He thought that if they knew he hadn't been killed after all, they would come find him. We got so excited, thinking we could all contact our families, that we would all be rescued. It was really naive, of course. The next day, Mistress came and took Julian away, and then some technicians removed all of the monitoring equipment so we couldn't access the net anymore. I never saw Julian again. I think his parents must have contacted the authorities when they got his comm, and I think he may have been killed to prove that the infanticide laws were being taken seriously." "It's pretty fucked up, bro." She ran her fingers absently through her hair, surprised when they slipped through it so quickly. "After that, Mistress Sybil started to pay more attention to me. She sometimes took me out of the caverns and up into the domes and gave me different tasks, alerting the coding of the broadcasting system, tapping into netlinks, programming intelligence software to pick up on specific verbal cues and divert information to separate comm accounts. At first I loved it. Mistress was nice to me then, and it meant I got to leave the lava tubes and see some of the city. I feel like I was becoming her favorite, and that if I did what she asked me to do, eventually it wouldn't matter that I was a shell anymore, and I would be allowed to go to school and be just like any normal lunar. Well, one day, Sybil asked me to hack a communication between a couple of European diplomats, and I told her that the signal was too weak. I needed to be closer to Earth, and I required better net connectivity and advanced software." Cress shook her head, remembering how she told Sybil exactly what Sybil would need to craft the satellite for her young prodigy. Cress had practically designed her own prison. "A few months later, Mistress came to me and told me we were going on a trip. We boarded a pod ship, and I was so excited. I thought she was taking me to Artemisia, to be presented to the Queen herself, to be forgiven for being born a shell. It feels so stupid now. Even when we started flying away from Luna, and I saw that we were heading toward Earth, I thought that's where we were going. I figured, alright, maybe Lunars really can't accept me this way, but Mistress knows that Earthens will, so she's letting me go to Earth instead. The trip took hours and hours, and by the end of it I was shaking with excitement, and I'd worked up this whole story in my head. how Mistress was going to give me to some nice earthen couple, and they would raise me as their own. And they lived in an enormous tree house. I don't know why I thought they would live in a tree house, but for some reason that's what I was hoping for. I mean, I'd never even seen real trees. Still haven't, actually. She frowned. There was a short silence before Thorn said, "And that's when she took you to the satellite, and you became the Queen's programmer." Programmer? Hacker? Spy? Somehow, I never stopped believing that if I did everything she asked, someday they would let me go. And how long before you decided that you'd rather be trying to save Earth and royalty than spy on them? I don't know. I was always fascinated by Earth. I spent a lot of time reading Earthen news and watching their dramas. I started to feel connected to the people down there. Down here. More than I ever did to Lunars. After a while, I started to pretend that I was a secret guardian, and that it was my job to protect Earth and its people from Levana. To her relief, Thorn didn't laugh. He didn't say anything for a long time, and Cress couldn't determine if the silence was comforting or awkward. Maybe he thought her fantasies were childish. A long while later, Thorn finally spoke. If I'd been in your position, and I had only one decom chip that I could use to communicate with Earth, I would have found some dirt on a hotshot spaceship pilot and blackmailed him into coming to get me out of that satellite, rather than trying to rescue the Emperor. Though he looked serious, Cress couldn't help but smile. No, you wouldn't have. You would have done the same thing I did. Because you know that the threat Levana poses to Earth is much bigger than you and me. Much bigger than any of us. But the captain shook his head. That's very good of you to say, Cress, but trust me, I would have blackmailed someone. Chapter 19. Hang on, I just gotta... That was a very heavy paragraph, or chapter. That had a lot of weight to it. Poor little Cress. Chapter 19. Kai scooped his hair off his brow, staring at the holograph that floated above the conference table with a mixture of horror and awe. Part of him wanted to laugh, not at all because it was funny, but because there didn't seem to be any better reaction. The holograph showed the planet Earth, and all around it were hundreds of small yellow lights, many clumped above Earth's most populated cities. Hundreds of tiny spaceships. And they're all lunar, he said. We're sure? Tuesday. Without a doubt, said European Prime Minister Bromstead, his face grouped with the other Earth and Union leaders on the massive net screen. What's most disconcerting is that we're giving zero indication of their approach. It's as if they're all just flickered into existence 10,000 kilometers over our heads. Oh, said Queen Camilla of the United Kingdom, as if they weren't there all along, but we were unable to detect them. Haven't we been hearing for years about these lunar ships sneaking into our atmosphere, bypassing all of our security measures? Doesn't matter how long they've been there or how they got there in the first place, asked American Republic President Vargas. They're obviously there now, and this is obviously a threat. Kai squeezed his eyes shut. But why? She's getting exactly what she wants. Why threaten us now? Why show her hand? Perhaps to ensure the Commonwealth doesn't back out of the marriage alliance at the last minute? Bromstead suggested. But she has absolutely no reason. Kai huffed and dropped his hand back into the back of his chair, what had once been his father's chair. He was far too restless to sit down as he glanced around at his cabinet members and advisors, his country's highly educated experts, who were looking as baffled as he felt. What do you make of all this? His experts traded looks among themselves before Chairman Deschelhui started to drum his fingers against the table. It does seem to indicate that they're sending us a message of some sort. Okay. Perhaps this is their way of RSVPing for the wedding. Oh, he muttered that. Hang on. Perhaps... Good day. Perhaps this is some way of... Perhaps this is their way of RSVPing for the wedding, muttered Governor General Williams from Australia. Perhaps we should ask them, said Con Torin, tapping a finger against his brow. If Luna is to become a peaceful ally of the Earthen Union, we might as well start opening the lines of communication. Naturally. Naturally. Oh no, because Prime Minister Common of Africa is a girl, but I can't do like an African girl's voice. Not like, because there is a specific for that, but I can't do it. Naturally. Naturally? The fuck was that? Naturally, said Africa's Prime Minister. I can't fucking do it. Naturally, said Africa's Prime Minister Common. The rapper? Anyway. I could all but hear her rolling her eyes, as they've been so open with us in the past. And you have a better idea? Williams. Hold up. Which one was fucking Williams? There's so many goddamn voices. I can't keep track of them. Queen Camilla, Minister Bromstead, right? President Vargas. Some fool. Oh, yeah, Governor General Williams. So this is the Australian. Crocky. I certainly do, said Williams. This could be our best chance to reciprocate the recent invasion. We should coordinate a full-scale attack. Take out as many of these... I almost said blighters. Take out as many of these ships as we can. Show Luna that they can't keep threatening us every... Threatening? Crocky. They can't keep threatening us every time Levana shows another fit. If they want to fight, we'll fight. War, said Prime Minister Common. You're suggesting we start a war. They started the war. I'm suggesting we end it. Common sniffed. And do you think our militaries are prepared to launch an attack against an entire fleet of lunar ships? We don't have the faintest idea what type of weaponry they have. And I think the recent attacks illustrated that they're not going to fight by any strategies we're familiar with. They're unpredictable, and as much as it pains me to admit, our military expertise has suffered from generations of peace. Our numbers are down. Few of our men have been trained for space combat. I agree with Australia, interrupted Queen Camilla. This could be the only time we've ever had the element of surprise on our side. Surprise! Barked Vargas. They're surrounding us. What if they're hoping that we attack them? What if all this drivel about the marriage alliance had been a ruse, just to keep us distracted while they move into position? Kai's knuckles whitened on the back of the chair. The alliance isn't a ruse. Nobody is starting a war. Camilla smirked. Oh, yes, I'd forgotten that the young emperor is so knowledgeable in these matters. His blood began to simmer. This holograph indicates that while these ships may have Earth surrounded, they are still outside the territorial designations of the Earthen Union, correct? For now, said Governor General Williams. Right, which means that for now, these ships aren't violating any terms that we've established with Luna. I'm not saying Levana isn't taunting us or threatening us, but it would be foolish of us to react to it without first coming up with some sort of strategy. William shook his head. By the time we finish strategizing, we may very well have been obliterated. Fine, said Kai, squaring his shoulders. The Treaty of Bremen states we need a majority rule to execute an act of war against any political entity. All in favor to attack these lunar ships, say aye. Aye! Aye! Said Williams and Camilla in unison. The other three leaders remained silent, but Kai could tell from their pinched expressions that no one was happy about it. Measure fails. Then what do you propose we do? Asked Queen Camilla. There is a lunar delegate staying in the palace right now, said Kai, cringing to himself. I'll speak with him, see if I can figure out what's going on. The alliance negotiations are between Luna and the Commonwealth, so just let me handle it. He cancelled the communications link before the other leaders could argue, or see how frustrated he was becoming. Frustrated that he never knew what Levana was thinking or what she was going to do next. Frustrated that he was bowing to her every whim, and yet she still decided to pull a stunt like this, for no apparent reason other than to get the rest of the Union all riled up. Frustrated that, if he were honest with himself, a large part of him agreed that attacking those ships might be the best course of action. But if war broke out, they had no chance of completing the peace alliance. which meant no hope for getting their hands on the Letimosis antidote. I'm gonna be real, I forgot Letimosis was a thing because we've been doing so much other shit. He glanced around at the other men and women sitting around the holograph. Thank you, he said, his voice sounding almost calm. That will be all. Your Majesty, said Nancy, rolling into the boardroom as the experts filed out. You have a meeting scheduled with Tashmi G in 6 minutes. He stifled a groan. Let me guess. We must be discussing table linens today. I believe catering staff, Your Majesty. Ah, right. That sounds like an excellent use of my time. He clipped his port screen to his belt. Let her know I'm on my way. Thank you for agreeing to meet me out here, said Tashmi Priya, bowing. I thought the fresh air might help you focus on some of the final decisions to be made in regards to the ceremony. Kai smiled wryly. That's a very diplomatic way of pointing out that I haven't been taking these wedding plans very seriously, which is probably true. He tucked his hands into his pockets, amazed at how good the crisp breeze fell on his face. He was still flushed with the irritation after the meeting with the union leaders. Although, it is nice to be out here. I feel like I haven't left my office all month. I suspect there is security footage somewhere to prove that. They passed by a koi pond, shadowed by the drooping branches of a weeping willow and surrounded by a patch of the gardens that had been recently dug up and tilled, prepared to replant for the coming autumn season. Smelling the fresh earth, Kai was momentarily baffled at how the life of the palace continued, how the life of the city and the Commonwealth and all of Earth had gone on, even while he had locked himself in that office and racked his brain for some way to protect it all. Your Majesty? He started. Yes, I'm sorry. He gestured at a simple stone bench. Shall we? Priya adjusted the fabric of her sari as she sat down. The gold and orange fish swarmed to the rocky barrier of the pond, hoping for food. I want to speak with you about an idea I've had regarding the hired vendors that will be assisting with the wedding ceremony, but it's one that I don't think Her Lunar Majesty would approve. Nevertheless, I thought that the decision should be yours. Hired vendors? Caterers, footmen, ushers, florists, and the like. Kai adjusted the cuff of his shirt. Oh, right. Go on. I think it might be prudent to staff the event with a mix of humans and androids. He shook his head. Levana would never stand for it. Yes, that's why I suggest we use escort droids that she would not recognize as such. She wants to use Horbots to... Okay. Yeah, alright. Use Horbots to serve the Moon Queen. I'm all about this. He stiffened. Escorts? Or escorts? We would use only the most realistic models. We could even place special orders for those with more humanoid characteristics. Complexion flaws, natural hair and eye colors, varying body types and bone structures. I'm sure to find that androids that wouldn't draw attention to themselves. I would be sure to find androids that wouldn't draw attention to themselves. Blech. Kai opened his mouth to refute, but paused. Escort droids were designed mostly for companionship. It would be an insult of the highest order if Levana became aware that they were at her wedding ceremony. But, they can't be brainwashed. Priya was silent for a moment before continuing. We could also use them to record the proceedings, in case Her Majesty or her guests attempt anything untoward. Has Levana insisted on having no cameras again? The Queen hated being recorded, and she demanded there be no recording devices at the annual ball when she was his special guest. No, Your Majesty. The Queen recognizes the importance of this event being broadcast on an international scope. She's put up no resistance on that front. He released a breath. However, with androids we can ensure that we'll have eyes everywhere, so to speak. Hopefully this will be a precaution that is unnecessary. Kai fidgeted with his cuff. It was a smart idea. The most powerful men and women on Earth would be at his ceremony, making it awfully easy for Levana to abuse her powers of manipulation. Having loyal staff who couldn't be affected could be an insurance policy against a worldwide political catastrophe. But Levana hated androids. If she found out, she would be livid, and he'd like to avoid any more outbursts from the Queen if he could. Thank you for the recommendation, he said. When do you need a decision? The end of this week, if we're to place the order in time. I'll let you know. Thank you, Your Majesty. Also, I wanted to tell you of a small realization I had this morning that amounts to one more benefit in broadcasting the nuptials. What's that? Her Majesty refuses to remove her veil while in the presence of any recording devices, and so she will wear it throughout the wedding and coronation. Reaching forward, she patted Kai's wrist. Which means you won't have to kiss her. He couldn't help a sharp laugh. The knowledge did relieve a bit of his terror, but it was also a painful reminder. He figured he would still have to kiss her eventually. The thought made him sick. Thank you, Tashmiji. That does make it slightly less horrific. Her whole face softened. May I speak openly, Your Majesty? Of course. She withdrew her hand and nodded her fingers onto her lap. I don't mean to overstep any professional boundaries, but I have a son, you see. He's about a year older than you are. Kai gulped, surprised at a tinge of guilt. He had never imagined who this woman might be when she left the palace every day. He had never bothered to picture her with a family. Lately, I've tried to imagine what this would be like on him, Priya continued, gazing up at the drooping tree branches. The leaves were changing to gold, and every now and then a breeze would shake some loose and send some pinwheeling down to the pond. What kind of toll would be paid for a young man with these responsibilities, forced to make these decisions? She took in a deep breath as if she regretted her words before she said them. As a mother, I'm worried about you. He met her gaze, and his heart lurched. Thank you, he said. But you needn't worry. I'm doing my best. She smiled gently. Oh, I know you are, but, Your Majesty, I've been planning this wedding for 12 days, and I've seen you age years in that time. It pains me to think how much harder everything will become after the wedding. I'll have Torrens still, and the cabinet, and the province reps. I'm not alone. Even as he said it, he felt the jolt of a lie. He wasn't alone. Was he? Anxiety crawled up his throat. Of course he wasn't. He had an entire country behind him, and all the people in the palace, and no one. No one could truly understand what he was risking, what sacrifices he may be making. Torrin was smart enough to realize it, of course, but at the end of the day, he still had his own home to return to. And Kai hadn't confided in him that he and Nancy were searching for Princess Celine again. He would never tell Torrin that a part of him hoped Cinder would be safe. And he would never tell a single living soul how terrified he was every moment of every day. How afraid he was that he was making an enormous mistake. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I'd hoped, if it wasn't too forward of me, that I might offer some motherly advice. He pressed his fingertips onto the cool stone of the bench. Perhaps I could use some of that. Priya adjusted the sari on her shoulder, gold embroidery catching in the sunlight. Try to find something that makes you happy. Your life is not going to get easier once Queen Lavanna is your wife. If you had even one small thing that brought you happiness, or hope that things could someday be better, then maybe that would be enough to sustain you. Otherwise, I fear it will be too easy for the Queen to win. And what would you suggest? Priya shrugged. Perhaps this garden is a good place to start. Following her gesture, Kai took in the stalks of bamboo bowing over the stone walls, the myriad lilies beginning to fade after summer's long showing, the bright fish that clustered and pressed against each other, ignorant of the turmoil in the world above their small pond. It was beautiful, but... You aren't convinced, said Priya. He forced a smile. It's good advice. I just don't know if I have the energy to be happy right now. About anything. Priya seemed sad at his response, though not surprised. Please think about it. You deserve a respite every now and then. We all do, but you more than anyone. He shrugged, but it had no enthusiasm. I'll keep it in mind. That's all I can ask. Priya stood, and Kai rose to join her. Thank you for your time. Let me know your decision on the escort droids. Leaf juice. Kai waited until she'd returned to the palace before sitting onto the bench again. A slender golden leaf fluttered into his lap, and he picked it up, twirling it between his fingers. Priya's advice had merit. One bit of happiness, of hope, could make the difference in preserving his sanity, but it was a request easier made than fulfilled. He did have some happiness to look forward to, seeing Levana's signature on the Treaty of Bremen, distributing her antidote and eradicating his planet of this awful plague. But those victories would come hand in hand with a lifetime of attending celebratory balls with Levana at his side, and next time, Cinder wouldn't be there to distract him. Though admittedly, that lifetime might be cut shorter than expected. It was a morbid thought that his premature death would at least keep him from too many painful dances. He sighed, his thoughts circling back to Cinder. He couldn't avoid thinking about her these days. Maybe because her name was at the top of every report, every news feed. The girl he'd invited to the ball, the girl he'd wanted to dance with. He thought of that moment, spotting her at the top of the staircase, her hair and dress drenched from the rain, noticing that she wore the gloves he'd given her. A smile tugged at him. It probably wasn't what Priya had in mind, the hopeless situation of all. The most hopeless situation of all. His relationship with Cinder, if it could even be called that, had been fleeting and bittersweet. Maybe if things were different, maybe if he wasn't marrying Levana, maybe if he had a chance to ask Cinder the questions that plagued him. Had it all been a deception? Had she ever considered telling him the truth? Maybe then he could imagine a future in which they could start again. But the engagement was very real, and Cinder was... He jerked forward, nearly crushing the leaf in his fist. Cinder was searching for Princess Celine, had maybe even found her. That knowledge was fraught with its own questions. What were Cinder's motives, and what was she doing now? How would the people of Luna react when Princess Celine returned? What kind of person had she become? Would she even want her throne back? Despite the lingering doubts, he did believe that Celine was alive. He believed she was the true heir to the lunar throne, and that she could end Levana's reign. He believed that Cinder, who had proven to be the most resilient and resourceful person he'd ever known, actually stood a chance of finding her and keeping her safe and revealing her identity to the world. It may have been a fragile hope, but right now, it was the best hope he had. Okay, that was good. That caught us up on the secondary characters we've forgotten about. Kai has a lot on his mind, and I don't blame him. It was very nice of Priya to want to offer advice like that. And she does have a point. Dude's gonna go crazy with the stress. And the spaceships, obviously they were revealed because the satellite went down, so Cress isn't hiding them anymore. Which just puts into perspective how many ships Levana has in orbit around Earth at any given time. The other Earth and Union leaders are right to be afraid. And I wonder what to do. They should at least get the armies and everyone ready for war. Don't make the first strike, but be ready, because war will break out. Catch you on the flip side, everybody.